It is April 5th, 1936, and the sun rises over Tupelo, Mississippi, just like it had for 100 years before. The town sits in the rolling hills of the northeastern part of the state, a place of red clay and pine forests, where the tobacco road of the deep south meets the beginnings of the Appalachian foothills. Tupelo is not a big city, not by any measure, but it is a proud one. It is the county seat of Lee County, and it has a population of just over 6,000 people, most of them living in neat white frame houses with front porches and vegetable gardens in the back. The streets are lined with oak and elm trees, and the air carries the heavy, sweet scent of honeysuckle and freshly turned earth. It is a Saturday morning, and the town is waking up to the familiar rhythms of a southern spring. The children are out of school, and the streets are filled with the sounds of automobiles chugging along the main drag, the clatter of wagons pulled by mules, and the chatter of folks gathering at the grocery store or the post office. It is a fine morning, the sky a pale blue, the temperature mild, and nobody has any reason to think that this day will be anything other than ordinary. But there is something in the air that morning, something that the old-timers might have felt in their bones, a heaviness, a stillness that does not quite feel right. The farmers who had been out in the fields before dawn noticed that the birds were not singing the way they usually did. The dogs seemed restless, pacing and whining without any obvious cause. The sky to the west was a funny color, a kind of greenish yellow that hinted at trouble brewing far away. Still, nobody said much about it. In 1936, there was no weather radar, no television to cut to a storm warning, no siren system to alert the town. The only warning a person had was the sky itself, and even then, it was easy to dismiss an uneasy feeling as just a case of nerves. The Great Depression had been grinding on for 7 years, and the people of Tupelo were used to hardship. They had learned to press on, to ignore the little signs of trouble, because worrying about things they could not control was a luxury they could not afford. By mid-morning, the weather began to change. The temperature climbed quickly, the air growing thick and sticky, the kind of humid that makes your shirt cling to your back and your breath come a little short. The pale blue sky gave way to a layer of high, thin clouds that looked like the veil of a bride, delicate and innocent. But beneath that veil, something darker was forming. In the west, a line of clouds began to build, growing taller and more menacing as the morning wore on. They were not the soft, puffy clouds of a summer afternoon. These were hard-edged, with a flat anvil-like top that spread out like a dark canopy. The light began to change, too. The shadows grew sharp and strange, and the colors of the world seemed to drain away, leaving everything in a kind of grayish-amber hue. By noon, the first rumble of thunder rolled across the hills, a low, distant growl that seemed to shake the ground ever so slightly. The people in town looked up, squinting at the sky, and a few of them muttered that a storm was coming. But spring storms were common in Mississippi. They came every year, sometimes several times a week, bringing heavy rain, hail, and the occasional funnel cloud that touched down somewhere in the countryside and did a little damage before disappearing. Nobody was particularly worried. The farmers had already brought in the morning's milk and eggs, and the housewives were busy with their Saturday chores, canning vegetables, sweeping porches, beating rugs. The children played in the yards, oblivious to the darkening sky. The men gathered at the hardware store and the barbershop, talking politics and baseball. It was an ordinary day right up until it was not. At around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the sky turned a deep, sickly green, and the wind began to blow in fitful gusts. The leaves on the oak trees turned upside down, showing their pale undersides, a sure sign to anyone who knew the land that a big storm was coming. The temperature dropped, and the air felt electric, charged with a kind of tension that made the hair on your arms stand up. Then the rain started. It did not come as a gentle patter, but as a hard, wind-driven assault that stung your skin and made it hard to see more than a few feet in front of you. The thunder crashed directly overhead, loud enough to shake the windows in their frames, and the lightning split the sky in jagged, blinding streaks. The people who were out on the streets hurried for cover, ducking into stores and homes, pressing their faces to the glass to watch the fury of the storm. And then, above the roar of the rain and the thunder, there came a new sound. It was a sound that nobody in Tupelo had ever heard before, a sound that would stay with the survivors for the rest of their lives. It was a deep, continuous rumble, like a freight train passing through the middle of town, except it was not coming from the train tracks, it was coming from the sky. The sound grew louder and louder, drowning out everything else, and the ground began to tremble. Then the wall of rain parted and they saw it. A massive black column was descending from the clouds, spinning and twisting, its base churning with debris that looked like a swarm of angry bees. The tornado, what would later be called the Tupelo Tornado, had come to call. The tornado touched down just west of the city limits, near a community called Gum Pond, and it wasted no time in announcing its presence. It tore through a string of farmhouses first, lifting roofs off as if they were made of paper, snapping hundred-year-old oak trees like matchsticks, and flinging cars and wagons into the air like toys. The farmers had no warning. One moment they were huddled in their kitchens, listening to the storm, and the next moment the world turned inside out. The wind ripped the walls away, and the sky was full of flying boards, glass, and soil. People were lifted off their feet and thrown into fields, into creeks, into the splintered remains of their own homes. Some never even had time to cry out. The tornado was moving fast, at least 60 miles an hour, and it was headed straight for the heart of Tupelo. It did not waver or wobble. It carved a straight, devastating path through the countryside, picking up speed and power as it went. The debris cloud grew so large and so dense that it blocked out the sun entirely, turning the afternoon into a kind of midnight. The only light came from the flashes of lightning that danced around the edges of the funnel. And the sound, that terrible, grinding roar, was all that anyone could hear. Inside the town, people were beginning to realize that this was no ordinary storm. The mayor, a man named Jack Harris, had been at his office when the rain started, and he had immediately telephoned the power company to ask about the situation. But the lines were already down. He stepped outside and saw the sky to the west, and he knew in his gut that something terrible was coming. He started shouting for people to take cover, to get into their cellars and storm shelters, but his voice was lost in the wind. The churches began ringing their bells, but the sound was swallowed by the roar. The tornado was less than a mile away now, and the trees at the edge of town were already being uprooted. The first buildings to be hit were the homes on the western side of town, a neighborhood of working-class families, mill workers, and sharecroppers, people who had saved for years to buy a little piece of land and a house to call their own. The tornado hit them with the full force of its fury. The houses did not explode so much as they dissolved. The walls collapsed inward, the roofs peeled back, and the floors buckled and fell into the basements. The people inside were buried under tons of wood, brick, and furniture. Some were trapped, some were killed instantly, and some were simply gone, carried away by the wind to be found days later in fields miles away. The tornado continued its march, moving into the more densely populated parts of town. It struck the business district along Main Street, where the stores and offices were built of brick and stone. The brick walls did not stand a chance. They crumbled like sandcastles, collapsing into rubble that clogged the streets. The plate glass windows shattered, sending shards flying through the air like knives. The tornado picked up a delivery truck and slammed it into the front of the post office. It tore the steeple off the First Methodist Church and sent it crashing through the roof of the grocery store next door. It lifted a school bus from the parking lot of the high school and dropped it on top of a row of houses 2 blocks away. The destruction was so complete that later, when survivors tried to describe it, they could only shake their heads and say it looked like the town had been bombed. But the worst was yet to come. The tornado reached the residential neighborhood around Gum Pond, a low-lying area near a small body of water where many of the town's African-American families lived. Their homes were smaller, built of cheaper materials, and they had few places to hide. The tornado hit the area with a ferocity that defied belief. It lifted the entire pond into the air, water and mud and fish, and then dropped it back down in a horrific slurry that mixed with the debris of the shattered homes. The people who had sought shelter in the lowest parts of their houses were drowned in the sudden flood. Others were crushed by the falling timbers. The tornado seemed to take a particular delight in that neighborhood, spinning and twisting, flattening everything in its path. When it finally passed, the area looked like a wasteland. The trees were stripped bare, the houses were gone, and the ground was covered in a thick layer of mud and wreckage. The bodies of the dead lay tangled in the debris, and the cries of the injured rose up into the rain-soaked air. The tornado was on the ground for about 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. It carved a path of destruction that was half a mile wide and more than 10 miles long. When it finally lifted, somewhere east of town, the silence was even more terrifying than the roar had been. The rain stopped and the wind died down, and the only sound was the dripping of water from the broken eaves and the soft moaning of the wounded. The sun, which had been hidden for so long, began to break through the clouds, casting a pale, sickly light on the ruins. The survivors stumbled out of their cellars and their bathtubs and the holes they had dug in the ground, and they looked around at what had been their town. There was nothing left. The streets were impassable, blocked by piles of brick and wood and twisted metal. The familiar landmarks were gone. The church, the school, the post office, the grocery store, all of them were reduced to rubble. The trees that had lined the streets were shattered stumps, and the few that still stood had been stripped of every branch and leaf, looking like blackened skeletons against the gray sky. And the bodies. There were bodies everywhere, lying in the streets, hanging from the broken remnants of walls, half buried in the mud. The living began to dig frantically, desperately, using their bare hands, shovels, any tool they could find. They called out to one another in the gathering dusk, calling names, listening for any sound of life beneath the wreckage. But all they heard was the wind moaning through the ruins and the distant sound of a child crying. The first reports of the disaster did not reach the outside world for hours. The telephone lines were down, the roads were blocked, and the railroad tracks had been twisted into impossible shapes. A man on horseback finally managed to ride to the nearest town, Takapola, and from there a telegram was sent to the state capital, Jackson. The word went out, Tupelo has been destroyed. The death toll is unimaginable. But even then, nobody knew the full extent of the horror. In the darkness of that first night, the survivors huddled together in the few buildings that were still standing, a small schoolhouse and a church that had miraculously been spared. They wrapped their wounds with torn sheets and tried to comfort the children who had lost their parents and the parents who had lost their children. They sat in the flickering light of kerosene lamps and listened to the sounds of the injured being pulled from the rubble. They did not know that the death count would eventually rise to over 200, that more than 1,000 people would be injured, and that the entire town would have to be rebuilt from the ground up. They did not know that this tornado would become one of the deadliest in American history, remembered alongside the tri-state tornado of 1925 and the Joplin tornado of 2001. All they knew was that their world had been turned upside down and that nothing would ever be the same again. And in the darkness of that night, as the search for survivors continued by lantern light, the people of Tupelo began to do what they had always done in times of trouble. They began to dig. They began to pray. They began to hope. And they began to count the cost of living through a day that had started so ordinary and had ended in absolute, overwhelming catastrophe. In the pale light of the first dawn, the scale of the tragedy began to reveal itself. The survivors who had made it through the night emerged from their shelters, their eyes hollow and their clothes caked with mud and blood. They found a world that had been rearranged by forces they could not comprehend. The streets, where they still existed, were not streets at all but pathways through mountains of debris. The landmarks they had used to navigate their lives for decades were gone. The hardware store where the men gathered on Saturday mornings, the diner where the women drank coffee and shared news, the library with its tall windows and quiet reading rooms, all of it had been erased. In their place was a jumble of splintered timber and shattered glass and torn fabric that had once been the curtains in someone's kitchen, the quilt on someone's bed, the shirt someone had been wearing when the wind took them. The living set to work with a grim determination that came from somewhere deep and primal. They had no heavy equipment, no cranes, no bulldozers. They had their hands, their shovels, their crowbars, and their will. They formed lines, passing bricks and boards from one person to the next, clearing small spaces where they might find someone still alive. The calls went out again and again. Is anyone in there? Can you hear me? Tap if you can hear me. And sometimes from beneath the wreckage there came a faint tapping, a sound that sent a surge of hope through the line of workers. They would dig faster then, more carefully, their hands bleeding from the sharp edges of broken glass and twisted metal. They would pull aside a beam and find a child, curled up and frightened but alive, or an old woman, still holding the photograph of her husband who had died 20 years before, or a man with a leg trapped under a heavy piece of machinery, gritting his teeth against the pain and trying to smile. Each rescue was a small miracle, a victory snatched from the jaws of the catastrophe. But for every person they pulled out alive, there were 10 that they found dead, and there were hundreds more that they never found at all. The dead were laid out in rows on the grass of what had been the town square. The grass itself was gone, torn up by the wind, but the space was flat and open, and it became a makeshift morgue. The bodies were covered with whatever could be found: sheets, blankets, tarpaulins, pieces of clothing. But there were not enough coverings, and many of the dead were left exposed to the sun and the rain that came and went throughout the day. The relatives of the missing walked among the rows, lifting the corners of the sheets, searching for faces they knew. Some found what they were looking for and collapsed into grief that had no bottom. Others walked the rows again and again, unable to find their loved ones, and they wondered if the bodies had been carried away entirely, if they would ever know what had happened to their mothers and fathers and children. The news of the disaster spread slowly, carried by word of mouth and by the few telegrams that managed to reach the outside world. By the second day, the first outside help began to arrive. The Red Cross sent teams from Memphis and Birmingham, bringing medical supplies and bandages and food. The National Guard was mobilized, and soldiers came with trucks and rifles and shovels. The governor of Mississippi, Hugh White, declared a state of emergency and promised that the state would do everything in its power to help the people of Tupelo rebuild their lives. But the help, though welcome, seemed pitifully small in the face of the destruction. The entire town would have to be rebuilt, and the people had lost not just their homes but their livelihoods. The cotton fields that surrounded the town had been devastated, the crops flattened and torn, and the mills that employed so many of the workers had been destroyed. The economy of the town, already struggling through the Great Depression, had been dealt a blow that seemed impossible to recover from. But the people of Tupelo had a stubbornness that had been forged by generations of hardship. They were the descendants of settlers who had carved a life out of the Mississippi wilderness, and they had endured floods and droughts and fires and epidemics. They knew how to survive and they knew how to rebuild. In the days after the tornado, the survivors did not sit around waiting for the government to save them. They dug through the rubble of their homes and saved what they could. They pieced together shelters from the wreckage, using the walls that still stood and the roofs that had been torn away and then landed nearby. They cooked meals over open fires, sharing what little food they had with their neighbors. They tended to the wounded using bandages and medicines that had been donated by nearby towns, and they began to make plans. They would rebuild the town, but they would rebuild it better. They would build stronger buildings with basements and storm shelters. They would plant trees that could withstand the wind. They would create a warning system so that the next time a tornado came, they would have a chance to get to safety. The stories of individual survival began to emerge in those early days, stories that would be passed down through the generations. There was the story of a mother who had thrown her body over her 3 children as the house collapsed around them. She had died from her injuries, but her children had survived, sheltered by her body. There was the story of a man who had been thrown more than a mile by the wind and had landed in a haystack, suffering only minor cuts and bruises. He had walked back into town and found his wife and children alive, and he had wept with relief. There was the story of a young girl who had been trapped in the rubble of her school for 18 hours and who had kept herself alive by singing hymns in the darkness. When the rescuers finally reached her, she was still singing, her voice weak but steady, and the sound of it had given the rescuers the strength to keep digging. There were also the stories of those who had seen the tornado coming and had tried to warn others. A high school teacher named Martha Johnson had seen the sky turn green and had gathered her students into the hallway, telling them to crouch down and cover their heads. The tornado had ripped the roof off the school and had scattered the desks and chairs like toys, but Martha Johnson and her students had survived in the narrow space of the hallway. A farmer named Elijah Watson had seen the funnel cloud forming over his fields and had driven his truck into town, honking his horn and shouting for people to take cover. He had saved dozens of lives, but his own home had been destroyed and his wife had been killed. He never forgave himself for not being there to protect her, even though everyone in town told him he was a hero. The weeks that followed the tornado were a blur of grief and labor and hope. The bodies were buried one by one in a mass grave that was dug on a hill overlooking the town. The funeral was held on a rainy Sunday afternoon and the entire town gathered to say goodbye. The minister spoke of the resurrection and the promise of eternal life, but his words were swallowed by the wind and the people wept without shame. They wept for the dead and they wept for themselves and they wept for the town that had been lost. But even as they wept, they were already planning for the future. The rebuilding began before the last of the dead had been buried because there was no time to waste. The winter was coming and the people needed roofs over their heads. They needed schools for the children and stores for the supplies and churches for their faith. They needed to reclaim their lives from the chaos that had been visited upon them. The federal government sent aid, but it was not enough. The people of Tupelo relied on their own strength and the generosity of the surrounding communities. Churches in other states held fundraisers and sent boxes of clothes and canned food. The American Red Cross set up a temporary hospital in a tent, and doctors worked around the clock to treat the injured. The morticians came from as far away as Jackson and Memphis to help with the processing of the dead. The railroad companies sent teams to repair the tracks, and within a month, the first train arrived in Tupelo, carrying supplies and hope. The conductor blew the whistle as the train pulled into the station, and the people who had gathered to meet it cheered, because the whistle meant that the town was still connected to the world, that it had not been forgotten. As the months passed, the people of Tupelo began to talk about the tornado as something that had happened to them, not just something that had happened in their town. They spoke of it with a kind of weary reverence, a recognition that they had been tested and that they had not been found wanting. They told stories of the day the sky turned midnight green and the wind came with a roar that drowned out every other sound. They remembered the faces of the ones they had lost, and they honored them by building a new town on the ruins of the old. They planted trees and they raised new homes and they opened new businesses and they filled the streets with the sounds of life again. It was not the same as before and it never would be, but it was theirs and they had earned it with blood and tears and an unbreakable will to survive. And so the work continued. The days grew shorter as autumn crept into Mississippi and the nights grew colder, but the survivors did not slow their pace. They worked from dawn until the light failed them, and then they worked by lantern light and firelight, hammering and sawing and sorting through the wreckage. Every nail salvaged from a twisted board was a small victory. Every piece of glass that could be cut and fitted into a window frame was a reason to hope. The children helped too, carrying scraps of wood and buckets of water, learning the hard lessons of resilience before they had even learned their multiplication tables. The teachers among the survivors organized makeshift classrooms in tents and in the few buildings that had been spared, because they knew that the children needed not just shelter but also a return to normalcy, a sense that the world still made sense. The women of the town formed committees that divided the labor of survival. Some cooked meals for the hundreds of displaced families using community kitchens that had been set up in the open air. The meals were simple, often just beans and bread and whatever vegetables could be salvaged from the gardens that had not been destroyed, but they were hot and they were shared, and that was enough. Other women organized the distribution of clothing and blankets, sorting through the donations that arrived by train and by truck from every corner of the state. They worked with a quiet efficiency that belied the grief they carried. Many of them had lost husbands and children and parents, but they did not stop to weep for long. They wept while they worked, their tears falling on the fabric of donated dresses and coats, but they kept working because the living needed them. The men took on the heaviest tasks, clearing debris and rebuilding structures. They formed crews that moved through the town block by block, using crowbars and axes and their bare hands to tear down what was too damaged to save and to shore up what could be repaired. The carpenter who had lost his shop became the foreman of a crew that built new houses. The blacksmith who had lost his forge set up a temporary anvil under a tarp and hammered out hinges and nails for the rebuilding. The farmers who had lost their crops turned their hands to construction, learning new skills as they went. There was no time for specialization. Every survivor had to become a generalist, capable of doing whatever needed to be done. And they did it without complaint, because they knew that their own survival depended on the survival of the town as a whole. The religious faith of the community played a central role in the recovery. The churches had been destroyed, but the congregations did not disband. They gathered in the open air, under the same sky that had sent the tornado, and they prayed together. The ministers preached sermons of hope and endurance, reminding the people that the Lord had not abandoned them, that their trials were a test of their faith. There were those who struggled with their faith, who could not understand why a loving God would allow such suffering. They sat in silence during the prayers, their eyes fixed on the ground, their hearts heavy with doubt. But even they found a measure of comfort in the presence of others, in the knowledge that they were not alone in their sorrow. The communal rituals of worship and mourning helped to bind the survivors together, creating a shared identity that would outlast the memory of the storm. The Red Cross teams remained in Tupelo for several months, providing medical care and distributing supplies. The doctors and nurses worked out of a large tent that had been set up in the town square, treating everything from broken bones to infections to the psychological trauma that afflicted so many. The term post-traumatic stress did not exist in 1936, but the symptoms were real. There were survivors who could not sleep because every sound reminded them of the roar of the wind. There were children who would not go outside when the sky grew dark, who clung to their mothers and screamed at the sound of thunder. The doctors did what they could, prescribing rest and quiet, and in the most severe cases, sedatives that dulled the edge of the terror. But the true healing came from the passage of time and from the steady rhythm of daily work. One of the most remarkable stories of the aftermath involved a woman named Clara Bennett. Clara had been a schoolteacher before the tornado, a quiet, unassuming woman in her late 40s who lived alone in a small house on the edge of town. When the tornado struck, Clara had been in her root cellar, preserving vegetables for the winter. The house had been torn apart above her, but the cellar had held, and she had emerged to find her neighborhood reduced to a wasteland. Without hesitation, she had begun to search for survivors, pulling bricks and beams aside with her bare hands until her fingers bled. She had found a young boy trapped under the remains of his home, and she had carried him to the makeshift hospital even though her own arms were weak from exhaustion. In the days that followed, Clara became the de facto organizer of the relief efforts in her part of town. She kept lists of the missing, coordinated the distribution of food, and counseled the grieving with a calm wisdom that seemed to come from a place deeper than experience. She never sought recognition, never gave interviews to the reporters who came from Atlanta and Chicago and New York. She simply did the work that needed to be done, and her neighbors revered her for it. The reporters themselves were a presence in Tupelo for weeks after the disaster. They came from the big newspapers and the wire services, carrying cameras and notebooks and a hunger for stories that the survivors often found exhausting. The reporters asked questions that seemed insensitive, that forced the survivors to relive the worst moments of their lives. They took photographs of the destruction and of the grieving families, and those photographs appeared in newspapers across the country, bringing the tragedy of Tupelo into the living rooms of people who had never heard of the town before. Some of the survivors resented the intrusion, but others understood that the publicity was necessary. The photographs and the stories generated donations, brought volunteers, and kept the pressure on the government to provide assistance. A photograph of a mother weeping over the body of her child could move the hearts of strangers in ways that a simple plea for help could not. The governor of Mississippi, Hugh White, visited Tupelo several times in the weeks after the tornado. He walked through the rubble, spoke with the survivors, and promised that the state would not forget them. He used his influence to secure federal funds for the rebuilding, and he worked with the Works Progress Administration to provide jobs for the unemployed men of the town. The WPA put men to work building new roads, repairing the water system, and constructing a new city hall. These were not make-work projects. They were essential to the town's recovery. The men who worked on them earned a small wage, enough to feed their families and buy clothes for the winter, and they took pride in the fact that they were building something that would last. The early months of 1937 saw Tupelo begin to take shape again. New buildings rose where the old ones had fallen, and they were built to a higher standard. The town council passed a new building code that required storm cellars in all new homes and businesses. Schools were constructed with reinforced hallways where students could take shelter. The town also invested in a warning system, a network of sirens that could be activated when threatening weather approached. These measures were controversial at first. Some residents argued that the town could not afford them, that the money should be spent on more immediate needs. But the memory of April 5th was too fresh, too painful, and the measures passed. Tupelo would be a safer town, even if safety came at a cost. The cotton fields that had been devastated by the tornado slowly recovered. The farmers planted new crops in the spring, and the mills reopened one by one. The economy of the town was still fragile, still dependent on the whims of the market and the weather, but there was a cautious optimism. The people had proven that they could survive the worst, and that confidence carried them through the long years of the Great Depression. They had faced the fury of nature and had not been broken. They had lost everything and had rebuilt from nothing. They had wept together and worked together and prayed together, and they had emerged on the other side of grief with a bond that no storm could sever. The stories of the tornado became part of the folklore of Tupelo, passed down from parents to children, from grandparents to grandchildren. The children who had lived through the storm grew up and had children of their own, and they told them about the day the sky turned green and the wind came with a roar like 1,000 trains. They told them about the heroism of Martha Johnson and Elijah Watson and Clara Bennett. They told them about the mass grave on the hill, where 88 people lay buried, their names inscribed on a simple granite marker. The children listened with wide eyes, and they understood that they were part of something larger than themselves, a community that had been tested by fire and had not burned. In 1937, a year after the tornado, a young boy named Elvis Presley celebrated his second birthday in a small house on the outskirts of Tupelo. He had been born on January 8, 1935, just a little over a year before the tornado. His family had been among the survivors, though they had lost their home and most of their possessions. They had rebuilt like everyone else, and the boy grew up in the shadow of the disaster. It is impossible to say how much the tornado shaped his early life, but it is a striking coincidence that the town that gave birth to the king of rock and roll was the same town that had been laid waste by one of the deadliest tornadoes in American history. The resilience of Tupelo, its ability to rise from the rubble and create something new, found an echo in the music that Elvis would later create, music that blended sorrow and joy, that came from the heart of a people who had learned to sing through their tears. As the years passed, the physical scars of the tornado faded. The new buildings aged and weathered, and the trees that had been planted grew tall. But the emotional scars remained, hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. There were survivors who never fully recovered, who lived with a constant low-grade anxiety that flared whenever the sky darkened. There were those who could not speak of the tornado without weeping, even decades later. And there were those who found a strange kind of strength in the memory, who used it as a touchstone for their own endurance. They would say, with a mixture of sadness and pride, that they had survived the tornado of 1936 and that nothing that came after could ever be that hard. And they were right. For the rest of their lives, every hardship was measured against that single day, and every hardship was found to be lighter. The town of Tupelo eventually became known for other things. It became the site of the Elvis Presley birthplace, a museum and memorial that drew tourists from around the world. It grew into a regional center for commerce and industry, its economy diversifying beyond cotton and textiles. It built schools and hospitals and parks, and it became a place where people wanted to live. But the old-timers, the ones who had been there in 1936, never forgot what had happened. They would point to a certain building and say that was rebuilt after the tornado. They would walk through the cemetery and pause at the mass grave, touching the stone and murmuring a silent prayer. They knew that their town had been forged in tragedy, and that the bonds of community that held it together had been forged in that same fire. The legacy of the Tupelo tornado is not just a legacy of destruction, but a legacy of survival. It is a reminder that human beings, when faced with the worst that nature can throw at them, have an almost infinite capacity for resilience. The people of Tupelo did not simply rebuild their town, they rebuilt their lives, their families, their sense of purpose. They did it with their own hands, with their own sweat, with their own tears. And they did it together because they understood that no one could survive alone. That lesson, learned in the ruins of a small Mississippi town, is one that echoes through the years, a testament to the strength of the human spirit. The lesson learned in the ruins of that small Mississippi town did not stay confined to Tupelo. It spread outward, carried by the newsreels and the newspaper columns, by the letters that survivors wrote to relatives in other states, and by the quiet determination of the people who had rebuilt their lives. Across the South, communities that had been struck by tornadoes in previous years looked at Tupelo and saw what was possible. They saw that a town could be destroyed and yet choose to rise again. They saw that grief could coexist with hope, and that the human spirit was more durable than any building made of wood and brick. In the decades that followed, the science of meteorology advanced in ways that would have seemed impossible in 1936. The Weather Bureau, which had been so powerless to predict the Tupelo tornado, began to develop new tools and techniques. Weather radar, first used during World War II, was adapted for civilian use in the 1950s. Forecasters learned to read the signatures of severe storms on radar screens to identify the hook echoes that indicated rotation. The term tornado warning entered the public vocabulary. Communities across the tornado-prone regions of the country built networks of spotters, trained volunteers who watched the sky and called in reports. Sirens became standard equipment in towns large and small. And yet, despite all of this progress, the tornado remained a force that could not be tamed. It could be predicted with greater accuracy, but it could not be stopped. The people of Tupelo knew this better than anyone. They had seen the sky turn green. They had heard the roar. They had felt the ground shake as if the earth itself was being torn apart, and they had survived. But survival came with a cost that was counted not in dollars but in memories. There were nights when the wind would pick up and the branches of the trees would scrape against the windows, and the old survivors would lie awake in their beds, their hearts pounding, their hands gripping the sheets. They would listen to the wind and wonder if this was the one that would take them. And then the wind would die down and the rain would stop and the morning would come and they would get up and go about their business because that was what they did. They lived. One of those survivors was a woman named Lillian Carter who had been 22 years old on the day of the tornado. She had been working at a dry goods store on Main Street when the sky turned dark. She had taken shelter in the basement with the owner and two customers. They had huddled together in the darkness, listening to the sound of the building being ripped apart above them. When it was over, they had climbed out through a hole in the debris and found themselves standing in a world that had been turned inside out. Lillian lost her home, her parents, and her younger brother. She had no one left, but she did not leave Tupelo, she stayed. She worked at the same dry goods store which was rebuilt, and she lived in a small apartment above it. She never married, she never had children. She became a fixture of the town, known for her quiet smile and her willingness to help anyone who needed it. When people asked her why she stayed, she would say, "Because this is my home," and they would nod because they understood. 40 years after the tornado in 1976, Lillian Carter was interviewed by a young reporter from the Tupelo Journal. The reporter asked her if she still thought about that day. She said she thought about it every day. Not in a way that haunted her, she explained, but in a way that reminded her of what mattered. She said that the tornado had stripped away everything that was unimportant. It had taken her family, her possessions, her future plans. But it had left her with a clarity that she might never have found otherwise. She knew that the only things worth holding onto were the people you loved and the place you called home. Everything else was just wood and cloth and paper. It could be replaced. People could not. The reporter wrote a beautiful article about Lillian, and it was published on the front page of the paper on the anniversary of the storm. The article was reprinted in a collection of stories about the tornado, and it was read by people who had never been to Tupelo. It became a small piece of the larger narrative, a reminder that the tragedy was not just a statistic, but a collection of individual lives, each one carrying its own weight of sorrow and resilience. As the decades passed, the generation that had lived through the tornado began to dwindle. The survivors grew old. They moved into nursing homes or they passed away in their sleep. The children who had been toddlers in 1936 became grandparents. The grandchildren grew up and moved away to cities across the country. But the story did not die. It was kept alive by the annual commemorations, by the museum exhibits, by the school projects, and by the simple act of remembering. Every year on April 5th, the town held a ceremony at the mass grave. The mayor would speak. A minister would offer a prayer. The names of the 88 known victims would be read aloud. Sometimes there would be a lone bagpiper playing Amazing Grace. And the older residents would stand in the cemetery, their heads bowed, and they would remember. In the 198 the town of Tupelo undertook a major restoration of the Elvis Presley birthplace. The small house where the king had been born was preserved and turned into a museum. A park was built around it with walking trails and a chapel. Tourists came by the thousands, and they heard not only about the life of Elvis, but about the tornado that had struck the town just months after his birth. Many of those tourists had never heard of the Tupelo tornado before. They stood in front of the exhibits looking at the black and white photographs of the devastation, and they felt a connection to a place they had never known. They realized that the town that had produced a musical legend was also a town that had been tested by disaster and had endured. The tornado of 1936 also had a lasting impact on the way that emergency management was conducted in the United States. In the years after the storm, the Red Cross refined its disaster response protocols. The federal government began to take a more active role in providing aid to communities that had been devastated by natural disasters. The Works Progress Administration, which had helped rebuild Tupelo, became a model for later programs that would provide jobs and infrastructure in the wake of hurricanes, floods, and earthquakes. And the people of Tupelo themselves became advocates for better warning systems. They wrote letters to their congressmen. They testified at hearings. They pushed for the development of a national network of weather radar that could detect tornadoes before they struck. In 1953, a tornado struck the town of Worcester, Massachusetts, killing 94 people. That tragedy, combined with the lessons learned from Tupelo and other storms, led to the creation of the National Severe Storms Forecast Center, which would later become the Storm Prediction Center. The science of tornado forecasting advanced rapidly, and by the 1970s, meteorologists were able to issue warnings with lead times of 15 to 20 minutes. Those warnings saved countless lives, and every time a warning was issued, whether in Oklahoma or Alabama or Texas, the echoes of Tupelo could be heard. The people who had survived the 1936 tornado had shown the nation what was possible. They had shown that preparation and resilience could make the difference between life and death. By the turn of the 21st century, Tupelo had grown into a city of nearly 40,000 people. It had a thriving downtown, a regional hospital, and a university. It was a place of business and culture, a hub for the northeastern part of Mississippi. The cotton fields that had once defined the landscape were largely gone, replaced by subdivisions and shopping centers, but the landmarks of the tornado remained. The mass grave on the hill was still there, maintained by the city, a place of quiet reflection. The Tupelo Tornado Museum, housed in the old city hall, displayed artifacts from the storm. Twisted pieces of metal, a clock that had stopped at 8:58, a child's doll that had been found miles away. Visitors walked through the exhibits and read the stories of Martha Johnson and Elijah Watson and Clara Bennett, and they came away with a sense of awe at the strength of ordinary people. One visitor to the museum was a young meteorologist from Oklahoma. He had studied tornadoes his entire life. He had chased storms across the Great Plains, had seen the inside of a tornado from a safe distance. But standing in the museum, looking at the photographs of Tupelo, he felt something he had never felt before. He felt the weight of history. He realized that the science he practiced was built on the shoulders of those who had suffered. The data he used, the models he ran, the warnings he issued, all of it was informed by the experiences of people like Lillian Carter, people who had lived through the worst and had chosen to share their stories so that others might be spared. He left the museum that day with a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to honoring the memory of the 88 by doing everything in his power to prevent another tragedy of that scale. The years continued to pass. The town commemorated the 75th anniversary of the tornado in Tuesday Reunion. By then, only a handful of survivors were still alive. They were in their 80s and 90s, frail but sharp. They were brought to the ceremony in wheelchairs and they were seated in the front row. The mayor gave a speech. A choir sang. The names were read. And then, with the help of a young volunteer, one of the survivors, a woman named Gladys Thompson, stood up. She was 97 years old. She had been 22 on the day of the tornado. She had lost her husband and her infant daughter. She had never remarried. She had lived alone for 75 years. Now she stood before the crowd and she spoke in a voice that was soft but clear. She said, "I have lived a long life. I have seen many things, but I have never forgotten what it means to be loved and what it means to lose. And I have never forgotten that this town is my family." Her words were met with silence and then with applause. People wept. They embraced her. They thanked her. And in that moment, the tornado of 1936 was not just a historical event. It was a living memory, carried in the heart of a woman who had refused to let it destroy her. It was a reminder that the human spirit endures, that love outlasts loss, that a community can be broken but never defeated. As the years go by, the memory of the Tupelo tornado will eventually fade from living memory. The last survivors will pass away, and the stories will become the stuff of history books and museum exhibits. But the lessons will remain. The town of Tupelo stands today as a testament to what can be achieved when people come together in the face of unimaginable tragedy. It is a town that was rebuilt not just with lumber and nails, but with hope and determination. It is a town that chose to face the future rather than dwell on the past, without forgetting the past that shaped it. And so when we look back at the Tupelo tornado of 1936, we are not just looking at a disaster. We are looking at a story of survival, of community, of the unbreakable bond that ties people to one another and to the place they call home. It is a story that reminds us that even in the darkest moments there is light. Even in the most terrible destruction there is the seed of renewal. And even in the deepest grief there is the possibility of joy. The wind that swept through Tupelo on that April evening took away everything it could. But it could not take away the love that people held for one another. It could not take away their faith. It could not take away their will to go on. And that in the end is what made Tupelo not just a survivor but a symbol. The sun rose over the town the next morning, and it has risen every morning since. The people who lived through that day are gone now, most of them, but their spirit remains. It is in the buildings that were built to withstand the storm. It is in the sirens that sound on a spring afternoon. It is in the faces of the children who walk through the museum and learn about what happened. It is in the quiet prayer that is whispered at the mass grave. It is in the heart of a town that was tested by fire and emerged stronger for it. And that perhaps is the most powerful lesson of all. That no matter what comes, no matter how fierce the wind or how dark the sky, we have it within us to rebuild. We have it within us to love again. We have it within us to create something beautiful from the ashes. The story of Tupelo is the story of us all. It is the story of humanity in all its fragility and all its strength. And it is a story that will never end, but the story does not end there. Decades later, on another April day, the town would be tested once more. It was April 28, 2014, a date that would be etched into the memory of a new generation. The sky turned that familiar shade of green, the same color that had haunted the survivors of 1936. The sirens blared, and this time the people knew what to do. They did not hesitate. They did not wait to see if it was real. They had grown up hearing the stories. They had visited the museum. They had seen the photographs of the twisted metal and the mass grave. They knew that a tornado could change everything in an instant. The storm that struck that afternoon was an EF3 with winds exceeding 140 miles per hour. It carved a path through the southern part of the city, destroying homes, uprooting trees, and tossing cars like toys. But the death toll was one life lost. It was a tragedy, yes, but it was a far cry from the 88 of 1936. The difference was not luck, it was preparation. The warnings came 20 minutes before the tornado touched down. 20 minutes. That was enough time for families to gather in their safe rooms, for schools to move children into hallways, for businesses to shut down and send employees home. 20 minutes that were paid for by the blood and the tears of those who had come before. In the aftermath of the 2014 tornado, the echoes of 1936 were everywhere. The same Red Cross volunteers who had learned from the great disaster were on the scene within hours. The same spirit of neighbor helping neighbor emerged from the rubble. People did not wait for the government to arrive. They grabbed their chainsaws and their shovels and they went to work just as their grandparents had done. And when the national media arrived, they found a community that was already organized, already resilient, already looking toward recovery. One reporter, interviewing a woman whose home had been destroyed, asked her how she could remain so calm. The woman smiled and said, "My grandmother survived the 1936 tornado. She lost everything too, and she rebuilt. So will I." That woman's grandmother was a child when the tornado hit. She had been 7 years old in 1936, playing in the yard when the sky went dark. Her mother had grabbed her and thrown her into the cellar, covering her with her own body. They had survived, but their house was gone, and so was the father. The grandmother grew up in the shadow of that day. She never forgot the sound of the wind, the smell of the rain, the feel of her mother's heartbeat against her back. She passed those memories down to her daughter and then to her granddaughter. And on that April afternoon in 2014, when the sirens sounded, the granddaughter did not panic. She knew exactly what to do. She had been prepared by a story that was more than 70 years old. That is the power of memory. It is not just a collection of dates and facts. It is a living thing passed from generation to generation, shaping the way we respond to the world. The 2014 tornado was a test, and Tupelo passed it. Not because the buildings were stronger, though they were. Not because the warnings were better, though they were, but because the people had been taught from the time they were children that they were part of something larger than themselves. They were part of a story that had begun on a terrible night in 1936 and that continued through every storm that followed. In the years after the 2014 tornado, the city continued to grow. New neighborhoods rose where the old ones had been swept away. The hospital expanded. The university built new dorms. The downtown, which had been revitalized in the 1990s, thrived with restaurants and shops and a new performing arts center. And every spring, when the first round of severe weather was forecast, the meteorologists at the National Weather Service office in Memphis would look at their maps and see Tupelo. They knew the history. They knew that the city had paid a terrible price to learn the lessons that now saved lives. They made sure the warnings were clear and early. They made sure the sirens were tested. They made sure that the people of Tupelo had every chance to survive. The last survivor of the 1936 tornado died in Tuziratwatwo. Her name was Mary Lay, and she had been 9 years old on the night of the storm. She had lived to be 95. In her final years, she had become a living legend, invited to speak at schools and community events. She would sit in her rocking chair on the porch of her home, the same home she had rebuilt after the tornado, and tell the story to anyone who would listen. She told it the same way every time, with the same details, the same pauses, the same tears. And when she finished, she would always say the same thing: do not be afraid, be ready. That is all we can do. Her funeral was held on a bright spring day. The church was full. The mayor spoke. The governor sent a letter. And the meteorologist from the museum, the one who had felt the weight of history, came down from Oklahoma to pay his respects. He stood in the back of the church, listening to the eulogies, and he thought about the trajectory of his own life. He had become a storm chaser because he loved the science, the thrill, the beauty of the clouds. But over the years, that had changed. He had come to see tornadoes not as wonders of nature, but as forces of destruction that could be met only with preparation and compassion. He had seen what they could do to a community, and he had seen what a community could do in return. He had seen Tupelo. Now, as he walked out of the church into the warm Mississippi sun, he understood something deeper. The tornado of 1936 had not just shaped Tupelo. It had shaped the entire way the nation thought about severe weather. The lessons learned from that single event had been codified into protocols, built into radar networks, embedded in the culture of emergency management. And those lessons had saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Every time a family huddled in a basement, every time a child wrapped herself around a sibling, every time a warning came early enough to make a difference, it was because of Tupelo, because of the 88. Because of Martha Johnson and Elijah Watson and Clara Bennett and Lillian Carter and Gladys Thompson and Mary Lee. Because of a town that refused to be defined by its worst day. And so the story does not end with the passing of the last survivor. It does not end with the closing of the museum or the fading of the memories. It continues every time a meteorologist looks at a radar screen and sees the telltale hook echo. It continues every time a siren is tested. It continues every time a child asks a parent what happened here, and the parent tells the story. The story of the Tupelo tornado is not just about a disaster. It is about the human capacity for resilience. It is about the power of a community to rise from the ashes and to build something stronger than what was lost. The wind that swept through Tupelo on that April evening in 1936 took everything it could. It took lives, it took homes. It took the quiet certainty of a world that made sense. But it could not take the love that people held for one another. It could not take their faith. It could not take their will to go on. And that, in the end, is what made Tupelo not just a survivor, but a symbol of hope, a symbol of renewal, a symbol of the unbreakable bond that ties a people to their place and to each other. The sun rose over Tupelo the morning after the storm, and it has risen every morning since. The people who lived through that day are gone now, but their spirit remains. It is in the buildings that were built to withstand the storm. It is in the sirens that sound on a spring afternoon. It is in the faces of the children who walk through the museum and learn about what happened. It is in the quiet prayer that is whispered at the mass grave. It is in the heart of a town that was tested by fire and emerged stronger for it. And that perhaps is the most powerful lesson of all. That no matter what comes, no matter how fierce the wind or how dark the sky, we have it within us to rebuild. We have it within us to love again. We have it within us to create something beautiful from the ashes. The story of Tupelo is the story of us all. It is the story of humanity in all its fragility and all its strength. And it is a story that will never end.